If you've set foot in Brazil at all over the last couple of years, you'll know all about the frenzy that has swept across the nation like wildfire. Online sports betting. Outlawed for the longest time in Brazil, betting on football and other sports only became legal in the last few years, and delays in regulating and taxing the industry have turned Brazil into something of a wild west for online gambling. With advertisements for dozens of new bookmakers called bets in Brazil popping up every time you switch on your TV, open your phone, go to see a football match, or even just walk down the street to catch a bus. During the 2022 World Cup, fans watching matches in bars and at home would be cheering on corner kicks, lamenting both teams scoring and what the opposition striker to have a shot on goal. Scenes which European and particularly British audiences might be used to, but something that had never been a mainstream facet of Brazilian life. And now, almost as fast as the market grew, the government and societal pushback against online gambling is well and truly underway. And that's what we'll be discussing this week. My name's Ewan Marshall, Deputy Editor of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil. If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Cristina Vio, Andrei Novoseltsev, Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renarcido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozi Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more. So to learn more about the state of online sports betting in Brazil, I'm delighted to be joined by Cede Silva, our Brazilian correspondent, who's been following this matter closely for some time now, from legalization, regulation, all the way up to the current backlash. Cede, hello.
Hello, Ewan. Thank you for having me.
So just to kind of start us off here, just to situate our listeners and viewers, if you could give us a kind of quick timeline of sports betting in Brazil, and then maybe try and give us an idea of just how big this market is today and, how far it reaches.
Okay, so sports betting was banned in Brazil, as most forms of gambling are banned in Brazil since the 1940s. Brazil in the early 20th century lived a golden age of casinos. And these casinos, especially in Rio de Janeiro, but also in other cities, they were also politically legitimized because they sponsored arts. So Carmen Miranda, which is one of the most famous Brazilian names ever for a foreign audience, she used to sing in casinos in Rio de Janeiro. But in 1946, a conservative president named Eurico Gaspar Dutra banned casinos in Brazil and most forms of gambling. And the decade since the 1940s, most forms of gambling are banned in Brazil. Brazil does have federal lotteries, which are not only legal, they are owned by state-owned bank Caixa. And Brazilians, especially in some cities, as in Rio de Janeiro, they're also akin to an illegal game named Jogo do Bicho, which is an informal lottery used by big criminals to launder a lot of money and is concentrated in some wealthy crime families in Brazil, notably in Rio de Janeiro. But gambling as a whole is not as big as it is in other countries, and notably not as big as in places like Nevada, right? So in late 2018, President Michel Temer, he issued an executive order with a different objective. He was trying to raise money for public security. And in Congress gets to change the provisional decrees issued by the president. Congress included sports gambling as a new sort of lottery to accommodate Brazilian rules that permit lotteries. And since late 2018, sports gambling has become really big in Brazil, to the point that very soon they started sponsoring major football teams, and they have the names on their shirts, on their jerseys. And sports gambling websites now also appear in stadiums, and they sponsor TV shows. And they have become really, really big. So to give you an idea, only of the regulated market, over 100 sports companies, precisely 114, are in the list of companies that applied for formal registration in Brazil. Each of these companies, in order to operate in Brazil, they need to pay a 30 million reais fee. That's over $5 million. So we're talking about $5 million from each of these over 100 companies, only to start operating now, not to mention the unregulated gambling sports websites that are being taken off the air as we speak.
And yeah, just to put this in context, you mentioned there about all of these clubs, these football clubs in Brazil being sponsored by betting companies, television shows being sponsored by betting companies, and also the National Football Championship in Brazil, the top division, is sponsored by a betting company. This is something that, again, I repeat, for a British audience, doesn't sound too strange because, I mean, the way that betting companies have invaded the sport in Europe and the UK is huge. But again, we're talking about a market which legally, as you mentioned, has only been operating for a few years and already has this power in Brazil. And one of the, I think it looks like the backlash is starting to come already. Because one of the big kind of turning points, especially in the narrative about sports betting, was this recent report from Brazil's central bank, which had included findings saying that welfare benefit recipients in Brazil spent at least 3 billion reais on sports betting in August alone. So, you know, if you could tell us a little bit about how this backlash has come about and what's the government reaction been to all this?
Yeah, so backlash has been growing on betting companies, both from the government and some people in the opposition as well. So the central bank report that you mentioned, they mentioned that according to the central bank, sports betting and other forms of online gambling together amounted for over 20 billion reais only in the month of August. That is $3.5 billion. And part of this money came from recipients of Bolsa Familia, which has been used by people that are quoting from this report to mention that sports gambling are also taking money away from poor families. Before the central bank report, we already had backlash from two important lobbies in Brazil, which are CNC and Febraban. So CNC is a major lobby of commerce, trade, and retail companies, and also in service. And they have made a petition at Supreme Court to outlaw the legislation that currently permits sports betting in Brazil. So they're actually asking for sports gambling to be outlawed in Brazil, to be back the way that things were in 2018. And Febraban, which is the lobby of banks, has been pushing for the government to ban more and more ways of transferring money to sports gambling. So they have asked for credit cards not to be used. And the gambling lobby has already yielded that they will ban credit cards before the regulation takes place at the turn of the year. And also, Febraban is also trying to ban Pix, which is Brazil's hugely popular instant payment system coordinated by the central bank. And so the lobbies of retail and banking have pushed heavily against sports gambling, and now also the government. For example, Senator Randolfo Rodrigues, which is President Lula's chief whip in Congress, has introduced last month legislation to ban advertising for gambling. So gambling would be just like cigarettes are in Brazil. Cigarettes can no longer sponsor anything. They can no longer air ads anywhere except at the points of sale. And so the Lula's chief whip in Congress is now pushing for this as well.
And I mean, you mentioned briefly earlier that the kind of the government's push to regulate and to make these betting companies kind of toe the line, and that they would be required to pay a really lofty sum of money just to operate in Brazil. I mean, if you could just kind of sum up, are there any other kind of requirements that these companies have to abide by? I mean, there's a lot of companies that have, in the last days and weeks, have been taken offline as well for not complying with these things.
Yeah, so chiefly what we have seen is they are required to submit an authorization request. They submit a form. They're going to pay this license of 30 million reais, which is over $5 million. And at the turn of the year, from January 1, 2025 onwards, the betting companies operating in Brazil, they will need to have their internet domain ending with .bet.br. So if it ends with .bet.br, we know that it is in the finance ministry list. If it's not, it's not a company that's operating in Brazil. So these are the main criteria. The government also says that these companies will operate under some rules to avoid money laundering and other instruments, but it remains to be seen how strong these instruments are.
Yeah, very interesting. Again, if I could just bring this back to kind of personal experience as well, from someone who obviously you can hear from my accent, grew up in the United Kingdom. The ubiquity of sports betting is, if you've never been to England or Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, you would be shocked, I think, just how ubiquitous it is. And the idea, when this started to come in Brazil, I felt that this was going to be a really long-term problem, that the gambling addiction would kind of slowly take over the country until something would eventually be done about it. But this, the idea that I had over this like long-term introduction of gambling addiction and then long-term eradication and regulation has basically been condensed into maybe about 2 years. We're already seeing this backlash. Is this, I'm surprised it turned so fast. Are you?
Yeah, it's not only you and I that are surprised of this tremendous growth. The experts are also surprised. How do I know this? So late last year, I broke in the Brazilian Report an exclusive story about how the Lula government yielded initially to the sports betting lobby because technicians, internal staff at the finance ministry and at Brazil's revenue service, at the time they were discussing the regulation of sports gambling, they pushed for a rule that any winnings, any bet that a bettor would win any money, they would be charged income tax. It doesn't matter how small the bet was. But the gambling lobby pushed for to be a tax only on winnings over the minimum wage threshold, the income tax threshold, which is currently twice the minimum wage. And this rule initially won. So the Lula government yielded, and they're not taxing all bets with winnings. They need to have a certain substantial amount for them to be taxed. Why is this documentation important now? Because this documentation, which I obtained in 2023, which was when they were discussing, the Lula government was first discussing sports gambling, they have the expectation, both within the finance ministry and the gambling lobby, of how big the market would be. And the finance ministry at the time, they expected that the amount of gambling, sports gambling, would amount to around 6 to 10 billion reais per year. And the gambling lobby, which is called ANJL, the National Association of Gambling and Lotteries, they expect that in 2024, that the gambling market would amount to 38 billion reais in 2024. Ewan, they are both outrageously wrong, because per the central bank report, the gambling market in Brazil is already 20 billion reais per month. So it's 240 billion per year. So it's 24 times the amount that the finance ministry was expecting. And it's around 6 times as large as the gambling lobby itself was expecting. So even the gambling lobby and the experts at the finance ministry were not expecting sports gambling to grow as huge as it did in Brazil.
Yeah, no, fascinating stuff today. And yeah, I don't think there's anyone who expected it to grow as much as it did, quite to the extent that it has. at least at this point anyway. One of the latest pieces of news we've heard about this industry is that the Senate President, Rodrigo Pacheco, has approved a parliamentary inquiry in the Senate into gambling and money laundering suspicions connected with that. So, I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about how that came about, and what exactly is this inquiry or select committee going to investigate?
Yeah, so first of all, our foreign reader or foreign audience should know that this is not typical for Senate President Rodrigo Pacheco. He is notoriously lenient with parliamentary committees. He does not like to install investigations in the Senate. He acted to block the Senate COVID Select Committee back in 2021. Senators in the opposition at the time, opposition to the Bolsonaro administration, they needed to resort to a Supreme Court order in order for Mr. Pacheco to do his work and authorize the committee. And in 2022, senators wanted to do a select committee to investigate corruption in the education ministry, and Pacheco acted for that committee not to work. For that committee, that committee was never installed. It never took steam. It never happened. So it's not common for Rodrigo Pacheco so quickly, especially, to authorize such a committee. Senator Soraya Tronic of Mato Grosso do Sul, she altered this request for the committee in a given day. And in less than a week, Senator Rodrigo Pacheco read the motion at the Senate floor and authorized the committee. This is completely uncommon. So it's a sign of how big the backlash against sports gambling has been. What this committee will do, it's going to investigate money laundering. It's going to investigate what the companies are doing. It's going probably to use what has been found by the investigation of the civil police in the state of Pernambuco, which is investigating money laundering in Esportes da Sorte and other gambling companies, involving some very famous people, some very famous influencers who use their face to promote this sports gambling. And the different thing about this committee that is going to take place in the next few weeks is it's not going to focus on match fixing, because there's already a Senate committee investigating match fixing. Last year, we had one at the House investigating match fixing. So that was the first phase of investigations for Brazilians, is how sports gambling and the ability of the sports gambling companies that you can bet on things that are not the team that wins. You can bet on who does corner kicks, who commits a foul, who has the yellow card, etc. So this can influence, this creates an influence for bad behavior and for match fixing. So this is already discovered by Brazilians. Now, the next thing is money laundering and the effects of the huge amount of money in sports gambling on taking money away from other things like retail or people in debt that will not be able to afford to pay their interest to the banks and so on. So this is the new phase of this investigation.
Yeah, excellent. And so how far do you think that this backlash could actually go? Because I think as we've already touched upon, we were both surprised by just how far the gambling market could grow in such a short space of time in Brazil. Do you think we might be equally as surprised as to how quickly it could, go away? Who knows? I mean, you mentioned calls about potentially trying to ban sports betting again, but I mean, surely the genie's already out of the bottle in this particular circumstance.
Yeah, Brazil is very uncertain. We have a saying, Brazil, even the past is uncertain, so we never know for sure. CNC is a powerful lobby. They do have that petition to the Supreme Court. But just as we have seen with the case of cannabis in Brazil and the Supreme Court, these decisions can take lots of years. It can take several years until a decision like this takes place. We do have the push from the Lula administration chief whip to ban at least the sports gambling to advertise. So this is something I could see picking up steam in the future. But of course, because there's so much money involved, the sports gambling lobby has a lot of money. And now they're going to gain an extra political strength because they have applied, over 100 of these companies, they have applied for a legitimacy within the finance ministry. They're going to pay a license fee of over $5 million. And so this lobby is going to gain a legitimacy in the government for them to operate. And also, they will start paying taxes. There's not going to be as much income tax from the bettors, because most of the bets, most of the wins are too small for them to pay income tax, but they are going to pay tax over the called GGR, the gross gaming revenue. And when these companies start paying millions of reais in taxes, they're going to become also strongly influential because the government needs this money. They need the taxes.
Yeah, so that sounds like a great reading of the situation today. And I mean, just to finish off, I mean, so often in Brazil, these kind of societal issues and, cultural talking points, they always, fall on one side or the other of the political spectrum. And you've mentioned this maybe briefly earlier on in the episode, but is there a kind of different view of sports betting on the left and the right in Brazil? Or maybe we should be thinking about this in completely different terms?
Well, there is, it sort of coincides because part of the right, most notably part of the evangelical right, has always been publicly opposed to sports gambling. So I've talked recently more than once on the subject with Congressman Ottoni de Paula from Rio de Janeiro. He's a member of the centrist MDB party, an evangelical preacher. And I think he feels sort of vindicated right now because of so many bad repercussions on sports gambling. Families in debt, money that is not going to retail or to other activities that generate jobs, and so on. People that are poor, that receive the Bolsa Familia social welfare program and are also spending on sports betting. And in the congressman's view, this means that the discourse against gambling is not purely religious. It has a base in fact that gambling has a social harm to people, that gambling is addictive. It takes money from poor families and gambling creates debt and so on. So there is certainly, especially on part of the evangelical right, an opposition to gambling in a certain way. But on the other hand, we are going to see more clear the political lines when this select committee takes place in the Senate, because this select committee, unlike the others, is not focused on match fixing. So it's really going to be about whether or not Brazil should have sports gambling, and if it does, what are the impacts of that? What are the impacts of that on the economy, on jobs, on health, on public health? Whether the impact of that on other sectors of the economy and so on. So I think we're going to see the lines more clearly divided when the committee takes place.
Yeah, excellent, superb. Okay, so Sede, thanks a lot for your time. Excellent as always. And, as we know, this subject is going to continue to be a big hot button issue in Brazil. So I'm sure we'll have you back to speak about this at some point soon.
Thank you.
If you like Explaining Brazil, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second and it will help us reach a broader audience. Or better yet, you can sign up for the Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a subscription-based business model, and your memberships fuel our journalism and they help keep us going and growing. And thanks to our subscribers, we have been able to cover Brazil and Latin America extensively. And for our work, we've won and been shortlisted for multiple international journalism awards. The World Association of News Publishers, WAN IFRA, considers the best news website in the Americas for a small or local newsroom. And in order to keep doing this work, we need your support. So please do go to Brazilian.report/subscribe. I'm Ewan Marshall. Thank you very much for listening, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.